Greetings one and all, and welcome to the Chronic Rift. I'm Keith DeCandido.
And I'm Andrea Lipinski.
If you fancy yourself a writer and have a science fiction or fantasy manuscript just waiting to be published, we're going to give you a sort of a shove in the right direction.
Tonight we're going to be talking to several experts in the literary field who can help you get your work off the mantelpiece and into a publisher's hands. But first, the long-awaited return of the Colmini Watch. As many of you know, the Rift is looking for the character actor, most noted for his appearances on Star Trek The Next Generation as Transporter Chief Miles Edward O'Brien. This week we have him cited in an episode of the new Adam 12 as a priest and in the movie Come See the Paradise as a police officer. We would appreciate your writing to us with any other sightings to add to our list.
This week's book note is the May release of Emma Bull's Bone Dance. This is Bull's third book, her first two being the classic War for the Oaks and Falcon. Falcon distinguished itself by not being anything like War for the Oaks, and Bone Dance isn't like either of the other two. In this age of series and shared universes and sequels, it's sort of nice to see someone who can come up with something completely different each time out. Anyway, Bone Dance involves Sparrow, who is a trader of rare CDs and videos in post-apocalypse Minnesota, who gets caught up in a fight between two of the Horsemen, the very powerful telepaths who caused that apocalypse. Bone Dance will be released in May by Ace Books and will cost $4.95 in paperback.
And now, The Man in Black has the latest in video offerings for us.
We started this week's report with some good stuff for a change. On May 16th, they're going to release Predator 2. Although it doesn't have Arnold Schwarzenegger in it, it's got everything else you want in a good action-adventure movie. Unfortunately, it will be priced at $92.95, so go out and rent it instead of buying it. More good news. One of 1990's most talked-about films, Jacob's Ladder, is coming out to tape. According to one reviewer, a real reviewer as opposed to a video hack, this is the horror film of the 90s. Siskel and Ebert both loved it. It's also a little pricey at $92.95, but it'll definitely be worth renting. This week's out-of-nowhere title is Witchcraft 3, The Kiss of Death. I don't even remember Witchcraft 2. Nobody in the cast is worth talking about. This film was released by Academy Video, and they're not known for big-name movies. My producer is getting on me for constantly harping on the price of some cassettes, so I won't mention the price of this dog, except to say this tape costs a little bit over $1 a minute. Magnum Video provides a little relief this week with 8 reasonably priced schlock titles. These are Blood Bride, Brain of Blood, Camps of Death, Dr. Frankenstein's Castle of Freaks, Dr. Jekyll's Dungeon of Death, Mad Butcher, Mad Doctor of Blood Island, and Torture Chamber of Dr. Sadism. Quite a collection, and frankly, I like seeing schlock like this at $24.95. If any of you have ever heard of any of these titles, please, give me a call. By the time you see this report, Zillion Volume 3 should be out in stores that sells comic books for $14.95. For those of you who are into Japanese animation, like we talked about last week, this is a new one worth getting. And finally, are you a Clint Eastwood fan? In a rare move, both MGM and Warner have announced a combined promotional re-release of all of Clint Eastwood's films. This covers 24 different film titles. I'm the Man in Black, and this has been the Video Report.
Omega Zone and other area specialty stores carry many of the videos that the Man in Black spoke about. And now, here with us again with the coolest in comics is your friend and mine, Keith DeCandido.
Thank you, Andrea. And welcome to Comic Art Commentary. I'm Keith DeCandido. At least I hope so. The alternative press is full of all kinds of media tie-ins. These are adaptations or spin-offs from popular books, TV shows, and movies. These are very big things that attract new readers into comics and help boost sales. Always a good thing. For example, First's Classics Illustrated and Dark Horse's Aliens and Predator series. Innovation Publishing is real big on this stuff. They have or will be publishing 4 Anne Rice adaptations, a number of SF writer adaptations, including Gene Wolfe, Terry Pratchett, and Piers Anthony, and they've also done an adaptation of Child's Play 2 and are planning one of Lost in Space. The Lost in Space one, by the way, will have both Bill Mumy and Mark Goddard, actors from the series, involved with it. The latest is a Quantum Leap comic. This is a 12-issue series based on the popular science fiction TV series that will be going into a 4th season in September. It will have 12 different leaps by Dr. Sam Beckett, each by a different writer. The first issue will be written by the series editor, George Broderick. Number 2 will be by Comics Buyer's Guide columnist Robert Ingersoll. Future writers include Steve Dorfman, David Campiti, who is also the publisher of Innovation, Terry Collins, David Lawrence, and James Schlosser. The art will be by Mark Jones and Scott Rockwell. The first issue will be on sale in July. Innovation is also publishing The King of the Rocket Man, an adaptation of the 1940s movie serial of the same name, which was an inspiration both for the Commando Cody movie serials and for the comic book The Rocketeer Adventure Magazine by Dave Stevens, which is being made into a movie this summer. In fact, the release of the movie is roughly the same as the release of this adaptation, and the timing is not a coincidence. Finally, Innovation is teaming up with Studio Proteus to bring the Japanese manga series 3x3 Eyes by Yuzo Takeda, translated by Toshi Yoshida and Torrin Smith, and that and the King of the Rocket Man will be released in June. This week's comic in review is Drawn and Quarterly, anthology comic published by the Canadian publisher of the same name. They also published Dirty Plot by Julie Doucet and will be publishing such books as Chester Brown's Yummy Fur in the future. Even the best anthologies are uneven, and this is no exception, but there's a lot more good than bad here. The better ones include Maurice Velacoup's Homo Man, a hilarious gay send-up of Superman, R.W. Rowland's very cute Don't Talk to Strangers, Carol Moisowicz's woodcut illustrations to accompany Thomas Jefferson's words in We Hold These Truths to Be Self-Evident, Mary Fleener's hilarious Do I Look Like I Work Here? But the two best are Joe Matt's assorted autobiographical short stories lumped under the title Automat. All of these have a whole bunch of little tiny postage stamp-sized panels to illustrate them, and Michael Dugan's brilliant Black Cherry, which is about a guy working in an ice cream joint. There are some weak spots. They're all things that are too abstract, kind of, here's your brain on postmodernism. Works like Luke Giard's This Is My House, Carol Swain's B-Movie, James Sturm's Ring, and surprisingly, Julie Doucet's At Night, which left me terribly flat, given how much I like Dirty Plot. However, the good far outweighs the bad, as I said, and this stuff is interesting and literary and skillful and, most of all, fun. It's also both in color and black and white. Whether it is or not depends on the story's merits, which is a welcome change from most anthologies, which are either one or the other, regardless of how it's appropriate for the stories. It's dimly possible that Drawn and Quarterly will be at your local comic shop, but I wouldn't bet any money on it. You'd be better off sending away for this stuff by mail. Write to Drawn and Quarterly, 4550 Boyer Street, that's B-O-Y-E-R, Montreal, Quebec, Canada, H2J 3E4. Drawn and Quarterly is published, well, quarterly. 40 pages an issue, $3.75 an issue. A one-year subscription is $7.95 a year. That's it for Comic Art Commentary this week. In closing, I'd just like to say, hey, anybody notice the Flash TV show? It got good. So, of course, they moved it to Saturday night, where it's guaranteed to lose its audience and get canceled. I love when CBS does stuff like that. Anyway, back to you, Ms. Lipinski.
Thank you, dear.
You're welcome.
This week's memorable moment comes from me, because my last memorable moment, which was from Duck Dodgers in the 24th and a half century, well, got all technically screwed up, and also I'm a member of the staff now, so I can get whatever I want. My memorable moment is from the fantastic Grade Z film, Plan 9 from Outer Space. In this particular clip, you get to see some fantastic day-night discrepancies, plus you get to see the real Bela Lugosi, and you get to see somebody who's pretending to be Bela Lugosi. So, Keith, what do I get?
Well, Andrea, you win Mojo in the Pickle Jar by Douglas Bell, which is a new release from Tor Books, and a new release, Craig Shaw Gardner's Revenge of the Fluffy Bunnies. And that's what you get for your memorable moment. Congratulations.
Did you choose those two specifically for me?
Yes.
Thank you.
Anytime.
I think. And if you'd like us to show your memorable moment, please write to us here at The Rift.
Mrs. Trent, what's wrong?
So, okay, you're sitting there at the computer. You've got this brilliant idea. Okay, it's a variation on another idea somebody else came up with in a book, but it was 20 years ago. It's probably out of print anyway. No one will notice. So then you have to sit down and write it. Then you have to print it out. Then what? That's what we're going to talk about here tonight. How to get your fantasy and science fiction published. With us tonight are an editor and an agent to give us an idea of how you go about doing that. On my left is the editor, Ellen Datlow, the fiction editor at Omni, and who has edited a number of anthology books. And on the other side of Andrea is the agent, Lori Perkins, who has represented a number of horror writers, as well as some SF writers, some comics writers, and any number of other people. Ellen, when you're sitting there at Omni, going through the pile of stuff, what kind of things jump out at you in the manuscripts?
Well, with regard to what you just said about the computer, using a computer and printing it out, I would beg people to please first separate the computer paper, because you wouldn't, we do get manuscripts where the paper just comes, in a long stream. The physical look of the manuscript does count, because you have to remember that editors read thousands of manuscripts a year, and our eyes go bad. And so it's really, you have to double space, use one side, use white paper, black ink, change your printer ribbon regularly, and things like that. I mean, that really is important. There are manuals for style, and just in putting together any manuscript, and that's the first thing. As far as the aesthetics, the first paragraph and the first page are very important. If I'm not interested in a story within a page or two, I'm probably going to stop reading. Or maybe I'll skip to the end and see what happens, and see if my expectations meet what I thought was going to happen. You really have to grab the reader. And by grabbing the reader, I don't mean you have to have an explosion in the first paragraph, but you've got to either make something happen that's interesting, have an interesting character, or have good writing. But you can't go on just with description, with writing. You have to have something, a plot movement, within a few pages. And that's for a start.
Right. Lori, taking it from the other side, what kind of things do you emphasize when you're trying to sell something?
Well, original idea or a new twist on an old idea done very differently. Professionalism, someone who is well-read in the field that I'm sending, the genre that I'm submitting to. Someone with perhaps a track record in either fanzines or some of the science fiction, fantasy, or horror magazines. All of this will impress the editor who, if they take home 10 pieces that night, might pick this one piece out of that 10 to look at first because the person has more of a track record.
How would an ordinary writer go about getting a literary agent? Because I know someone who has an agent, and I asked him, oh, how do you get an agent? It all seems to be very mysterious. Oh, well, it's who you know. It's all connections.
No, actually, it's a lot of what you know. If you should join a genre organization if you write in a genre, Science Fiction Writers of America or Horror Writers of America. They will give you a list of recommended agents, 6 or 8, and you should contact them and ask them if they are taking on new clients. If they are, send them usually the first 3 chapters and an outline of your book. You should always call first, because sometimes an agent is no longer taking on new authors.
Or maybe out of business.
Maybe out of business. And you can just send your manuscript into a void and wait 5 months, 6 months, 5 years, not knowing why you haven't heard anything.
In science fiction, many young writers start off writing short stories, because there still is a market for short stories in magazines and science fiction. And once you start publishing short stories, you're visible, and very often agents will come to you. I mean, that's a lot of agents have approached people who have published in Omni because they noticed their stories and want to represent them. That's what happened with William Gibson. An agent approached him because they saw his stories, and actually a couple of agents approached him.
But you can also go to conventions, meet other writers, find out who their agent is, see if they will take a look at what you've written and perhaps talk to their agent or write a letter of recommendation saying, this guy's stuff is good, why don't you take a look at it?
It's the source of all those wonderful quotes you see,
That's
Stephen
right.
King quotes and C.J. Cherryh quotes and such on books all the time.
But writing involves a lot of screening processes. And the more credits you can get and the more people you can get to look at your work, but not your mother and your aunt. That doesn't count. I mean, in terms of opening letters, I like my opening letters short. Here's my piece, here's what I've done, read it, get back to me. I don't want to know. My mother, my sister, my brother think this is great. So does my third grade teacher, who I also sent it to, and so does my 4-year-old. It just, I don't know them. They don't mean anything to me.
My 4-year-old drooled on it, so it must be good. Right.
For short stories, generally, you don't need a cover letter unless you have a credit. If you have not published at all, a cover letter is not going to do any good. If you have some credentials in the field, then you put your credentials. Either I published here, there, and whatever.
What kind of credentials would be?
Publishing fiction before, either in the genre or outside would help even. As far as nonfiction credits, it doesn't really impress me that much because very often it doesn't translate into fiction.
No.
If you've taken a writing course, it will probably make me at least look at the manuscript first and maybe not, or I may give it to my assistant to read first, but at least I'll be aware of it, you know. If you're in a writing group, things like that. I mean, professional credentials are whatever you think will make the editor who you're dealing with take notice of you, of your writing.
But at that too, sometimes I will get a letter that says, I called Horror Writers of America and I know that you represent so-and-so, and I like his work, so therefore I've sent my material to you. That shows me that the writer's done some research. And I will usually take that submission out of the pile and look at it quicker.
They're willing to take it a little more seriously.
It's crucial to know your markets. I mean, that
Yeah.
is, I mean, you have to know if someone is publishing science fiction and fantasy. A lot of people send me horror. I rarely publish horror on Omni. There are professional publications that will give you market reports regularly, like Locus, Science Fiction Chronicle, the Horror Writers of America Bulletin, not bulletin, newsletter. I mean, if whatever genre you're interested in, or if you're interested in a few genres, you should get some of the information and find out what anthology markets there are, what magazine markets, and make sure you know that they're up to date. I mean, we get stories addressed to people who don't exist anymore in Omni, you know, fiction and nonfiction. And, you know, it's really an insult if you spell the editor's name wrong. Yeah, I mean, I've gotten that. You know, it's horrible. Or if you send it to the wrong person who's not. If there's a fiction editor listed, you send it to the fiction editor. You don't send it to the managing editor. You don't send it to the publisher. You don't send it to the editor.
And if you're not sure, call the magazine, or
And
call
ask.
the agent's office, or call the editor, and say, how do I spell this?
When you're, Ellen, when you're judging a story that's coming into Omni, does the genre matter for that? I mean, if you're having, would you favor something in science fiction rather than in fantasy? Because science fiction tends to be more popular.
No, fantasy tends to be more popular. You wouldn't believe how hard it is to get good science fiction stories. Everyone writes fantasy.
But I'm thinking of sort of the names of magazines. I mean, I know of fantasy and science fiction magazine, but then there's like the Science Fiction Chronicle and the Science Fiction...
Well, Science Fiction Chronicle is all nonfiction. Most of the magazine will publish fantasy and science fiction. Asimov publishes fantasy and sometimes horror. FNSF, fantasy and science fiction, they publish horror.
Analog seems to lean more towards science fiction a
Yes,
little bit.
they're
That's-
the
that's
only, I
fair.
think they're the only magazine that still will only publish science fiction. So when I'm reading a story, I mean, I'm always looking for good science fiction, but I don't judge the story that way. I judge it as to how it affects me. If it's an iffy story, if I'm not sure, and what I'll do is, I mean, I'll say, well, do I really need another story like that in inventory? You know, I mean, if it's that kind of situation that I'm not absolutely blown away by the story. But if I am, I don't care what it is. I mean, it has to have a fantastic element in it. I mean, I won't take a completely, you know, utterly mainstream story.
Right. But you said you also don't take horror stories.
Hardly ever.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, you got to have some kind of guidelines.
Yeah, I mean, you have to send, it's very good to send away for guidelines. To any publication, every publication will have guidelines. Will tell you what the length, the word length, the pay rate, what they're looking for. But the guidelines are just guidelines. They're not that strict. Excuse me, as far as content. The guideline is just, I mean, yes, there are always exceptions. So the guideline is not completely, you know, I mean, yes, I will buy horror occasionally.
One thing that, when you're selling something, especially a book, it's the old art versus commerce question. I mean, is it something that will sell more important than something that you think is particularly good, but probably isn't something that's going to grab people and sell really a lot of books? Or
That really has to do with, for me, you know, personal style as an agent.
especially for new writers in particular.
Sometimes I will take on a book that is very different and very hard to sell because I really love it and I believe in it. But I will tell the author that this is not what they're looking for, and the chances of selling it aren't as great as, say, if it had been a vampire novel or something like that. I try to take on a lot of commercial fiction so that I can take on more difficult projects. And sometimes I had one novel, it took me 2.5 years to sell. It was turned down by 33 editors. And I had a book about the Twilight Zone that it took me 2 years to sell, and then it was turned down, and I sold it again. So I could not represent a whole bunch of art. I will represent some things that I really believe in, but the more commercial the fiction is, the quicker I can sell it.
What if someone approaches you with a book or a story that is about a subject that you personally are not particularly fond of? Do you still try to sell it the same way?
I will send them to somebody else. I only represent books that I really love for one reason or another. I know all the other agents. We know what we sell. I'll recommend them, and sometimes they'll sell things and call me up and tell me, hey, they're at $50,000. Thanks a lot. But you know, I have to sell what I like.
Sorry.
Quite all right.
I was going to say, in short fiction, it's a little different. So,
Don't die in it here.
in magazines, you have more leeway. It's not really that commercial, especially in a magazine like Omni, where I'm publishing nonfiction and fiction. When you're publishing a bunch of different stories in a magazine, a genre magazine, you don't have to consider, it's not, no one story is going to sell.
Take a drink of water.
No.
Yeah.
No, it's
Okay.
right. Yeah. No one story is going to sell the magazine or kill the magazine. So it's different in the short fiction market.
Oh Lord, I blanked. I was going to say something.
I'm scaring you to
with
death.
no. In the horror field, is there anything? I know I've always thought that a lot of horror books tend to be a little more formulaic than science fiction books sometimes, especially the more popular ones.
There's a
Is
broad
that-
spectrum. There's a real broad spectrum, and I sell a lot of crossovers. So I'll sell horror detective fiction, or I'll sell dark fantasy, which can be marketed as either horror or dark fantasy. Actually, the horror field, I think, is spreading out, and there's a lot more that you can do with it than 20 years ago.
Is there less of a market for the blood and gore and guts? That seems to be waning
There's
a
a
little.
market for that, you know. Mostly teenagers, and it's a core group, and it's not going to grow, but it's steady. Just like there's a core group of vampire fiction readers. They sell 50 to 100,000 copies, no matter how well they're written or how poorly they're written. Now, there are these subgenres within the horror genre now.
Well, I've heard that there's a lot of horror fiction is now being published as thrillers and suspense. They're just being packaged differently by the publishers.
Yeah, serial killer is more or less a subgenre of horror or thriller fiction.
Yeah, they're really hot.
Then I guess you got American Psycho now coming out with its own little twist on it. You mentioned before about how the first paragraph has to grab you. Is that something you really stick to? It's like if you read the first two paragraphs, will you not read it if it's not, you know, even if it's not, like you said, a planet exploding necessarily?
If I don't know anything about the author other than the work that I have, and the first page is nothing special, I'm not going to go on.
If you deal with a writer who you're used to, and he writes something that's difficult, you'll go on with him because you trust him. And it may work out, it may not. But if a complete unknown comes up with 5 pages of boring stuff, or even 1 page, you're just not going to give them the time.
Not enough
Because
hours in
they,
the day.
well, you can't, they have to prove to you that they're doing this on purpose and that it's not just because they're bad writers.
No, an editor and an agent, you can't teach someone to write. You've got to take things on that can sell, or you've got to buy things that are ready to go. So if something's not ready, it means go back and work on it.
I mean, most editors are willing to work with writers, but you have to have a certain minimal literacy to begin with.
You have to know how to spell, yes. Things, little.
I mean, there are writers' workshops and writers' groups to teach you how to write, and classes.
There's a good book. Dean Koontz wrote a book in 1980 called How to Write Best-Selling Fiction. It's out of print, but you can get it in a library. And it's a real good book about pacing, characters, development of plot. I would really recommend it.
Yes, a couple. I know Orson Scott Card wrote a book on the subject specifically about publishing science
Fantasy
fiction.
and science fiction.
Yeah, and there's I think Davis is putting out a new book, and
Right.
there's a whole bunch of different things all around, and we're getting the wrap it up signal. We
Yeah.
must cease
Okay.
and desist.
All right.
Right. Next week is a very special show we're doing. We are doing an all-interview show, and we're going to have 3 people. Yes, Tom Dish, author of the MD, and Ken Hildebrandt, who's a well-known fantasy artist, and the new editor of Piranha Press, a comics publisher, Andrew Helfer. And we will do that next week.
Yes, we will.
And we'll see you then.
Good night.
Good night.
Sponsored in part by Comics Interview, the magazine where both the fans and the pros turn to see who's who and how it's done. For a free sample copy, a special discount on any Comics Interview publication, write to Comics Interview, 234 Fifth Avenue, Suite 301, New York, New York, 10001. Tor Books, a publisher of fantasy and science fiction books available at your local bookstore, including the currently available Days of Atonement by Walter John Williams and the soon-to-be-released Xenocide by Orson Scott Card, on sale in August. Omega Zone, a store specializing in comic books and video movie rentals, located at 46 8th Avenue between West 4th and Horatio in Manhattan. Telephone 212-645-6941. Bain Books, publishers of Larry Niven's Man Kazin Wars, Lois McMaster Bujold, Elizabeth Moon and Anne McCaffrey, Jerry Purnell and S.M. Sterling, and other writers of quality fun science fiction. Writing science fiction and fantasy from the editors of Analog and Isaac Asimov's Science Fiction magazine. Learn the inside tips and trade secrets of today's foremost professionals, including Isaac Asimov, Robert A. Heinlein, and Connie Willis. Order yours today and save over 25% off the cover price. Call 1-800-338-7531 to order by credit card.